Welcome to the Expert Network Team podcast,
where our goal is to inform and educate our listeners on matters related to finance, legal, insurance, accounting, and other interests that are of personal and business nature.
We hope you will find our content useful as well as entertaining. The Expert Network Team consists of Karl Frank of A&I Financial, Mike Miller of Miller and Associates CPAs, Jeff Krommendyk of Security First Insurance Agency, and I'm Nathan Merrill. I'm an attorney at Goodspeed and Merrill.
Together, our independent team combines our expertise to provide you insights and solutions, some straightforward, some profound, for real-life opportunities we see on a daily basis. We hope you enjoy the information contained in today's podcast and find it useful. If you'd like to learn more or desire to meet with any of the Expert Network team members in person, you can contact us at info@expertnetworkteam.com. That's info@expertnetworkteam.com.
And we encourage you to take advantage of a free consultation with any of our team members. Just mention this podcast when you schedule your appointment.
Now on to today's podcast.
All right, well, I think we might have our team, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm Karl Frank with A&I Financial Services. I'm going to introduce the team, let the gentleman in front of you introduce themselves, and then I'll be our moderator, just asking questions. And today's topic is asset protection. Here at A&I, we look at asset protection. There's four sleeves of that: financial asset protection, protecting your property, protecting your confidential information, and then protecting yourselves, personal security. And today's conversation, we're going to talk about the first two of those, asset protection and property protection. Next month at A&I, we've got a gentleman from the FBI going to come talk to us about protecting your confidential information. And on our website, we have a great presentation from Bart Combs about personal protection that we did last year, and we hope to get Bart or somebody like that again this year. So without further ado, again, Karl Frank, A&I Financial. We work with a small number of successful families. We help you grow and protect your investments and choose how you want to be taxed. To my left is Nate Merrill. Nate, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nathan Merrill. I am an attorney at Goodspeed and Merrill, and I primarily focus in the area of tax efficiency planning, both for individuals, families, and businesses. And a lot of what we do involves the topic today of structuring assets to protect them well into the future.
Great. My name is Jeff Krommendyk. I'm one of the founding partners at Security First Insurance Agency, located right here in Littleton. I'm honored to be a part of the Expert Network team that you see in front of you here, specifically around managing and transferring risk for homeowners or households as well as small businesses. We do that through the process of building long-term mutually beneficial relationships and also managing risk effectively. So thanks for joining us, and I'm glad to be here today as well. Mike?
Mike Miller, last but not least, I own and operate Miller and Associates CPAs. We provide tax preparation service, IRS representation, accounting and bookkeeping services, along with working with Nate quite a bit on entity structuring and tax planning for our clients. Work with all of these gentlemen, and it's a privilege to be here.
Great job.
One other thing real quick, I think it would be worthwhile to plug our podcast.
Right. So please do check out our Expert Network Team podcast. You can download it anywhere that podcasts are available: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on the internet at expertnetworkteam.com. Thanks, bud.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. It's a great podcast. And we talked about taxes, and it wasn't boring.
It was fun.
It was fun.
Of course, I always find tax discussions fun. So.
Well, there's a
You're
lot
a
of
geek.
Opportunities. He's unique.
I thought you said I'm a geek.
I did say that.
Oh, okay.
I said you're a geek.
I like his interpretation of it better. Unique.
I heard unique. It's the optimist in me. Well, Jeff, we'll just start with you then. So Jeff, you are our insurance expert, and can you talk a little bit about some of the ways we can protect our assets, and how much insurance is enough? What are some of the challenges that people are facing today, and what should we be careful to make sure we insure for?
Yeah, thanks, Karl. Happy to kick us off here. Start kind of on kind of the lighter end of things as we get into our hour together. But one thing I hopefully you all can notice is that we have a lot of fun here, don't we? I mean, it's good hanging out. We do this about once a week, put some podcasts down, and we have a lot of fun working together. So I'm happy that I'm a part of this. Yeah, great question, Karl. And I think, really when it comes to, really protecting both property and assets, which is in essence what we're talking about today. Insurance does play a large part in that, certainly. And there's certainly two aspects of it with regards to protecting the assets that you have from any type of named insured peril from a property perspective. So we want to make sure that all assets are protected adequately and insured to value with regards to hard assets. Those are things like properties, homes, rental homes, any income type assets that can be insured, such as obviously businesses, business personal property, buildings, property that's on the move. We think about that oftentimes with regards to businesses that have property that's on the move on a regular basis through an inland marine form. We talk about insuring vehicles, insuring private personal property and possessions, ranging from fine arts to jewelry to, just a wide variety of anything that's tangible is something that is clearly an asset of yours and therefore should be protected in some way, shape, or form. Vehicles as well, but in addition to that, any vacation homes, rental properties, and the such. The other aspect of what we really focus on, Karl, and probably even sometimes more importantly, not that your personal assets aren't important to protect, but I think there's a larger exposure with regards to your personal liability or business liability. And that's really where we spend a good majority of our time evaluating questions, just like you asked, how much coverage is enough? Because in this particular case, we aren't limited by insuring what your property is worth, respectively. So we can't insure your home for twice the value of what it's valued at. But when it comes to liability and any exposure you have as it relates to any risk that you're presenting to the public, whether it be bodily injury or property damage, those are numbers that we can really take into consideration and actually use some real in-depth thought processes as to how much liability insurance is enough based on, your exposure, the kind of risk that you're presenting to the public, as well as in essence, your net worth. And so we really take a pretty in-depth look at, first of all, what kind of risk are we presenting to the public, or is the client presenting to the public? If we have somebody that has an extensive and lengthy driving record, we know that that person's going to be more at risk to a large lawsuit than somebody who's never had a ticket before in their lives. Do you have a zip line in your backyard? Do you have a swimming pool? Do you drive fast cars? These are exposures that certainly would lead us to the conclusion that we need to consider maybe some higher liability limits. The other aspect of that is, well, what are you worth? What do you have to lose? And so that's really where we work together with Karl and certainly the clients to really determine how much liability coverage would be prudent for not only the risk presented, but also the assets to protect.
Well said. Great job. So along the lines of insurance, in Colorado, is there anything unique that we should be looking for? Particularly hail damage and other things like that. And what about business owners? Shouldn't they be looking at some particular things in Colorado too?
Yeah, great question. We are in a pretty interesting season in the insurance industry here, not only in Colorado, but nationwide. I think from a nationwide or a national perspective, of course, insurance is a pooling product, right? It doesn't work if we're just trying to figure out how much premium to charge Nate Merrill based on the exposure that Nate Merrill brings. We have to actually pool insurance premiums. So a lot of what happens out east, a lot of what happens out west does impact us here, and vice versa. And Colorado has been definitely contributing to its fair share of losses, to say the least. But there's a national situation going on right now, specifically around commercial auto insurance as well as personal auto insurance. There are a lot of things that the insurance industry does not know what to do with, specifically around distracted driving, as well as even the technology that's going into vehicles that are, being almost driven by themselves at this point in time. And not to mention the technology that's being embedded into every panel of the vehicle. And so vehicles are more expensive to replace today than they ever have been. We still have a major distracted driving issue that we just don't know how to curtail. And so auto premiums at this point in time, if you haven't already noticed in your own insurance portfolio, are somewhat out of control and will continue to be for a while. With that said, on the property side, hail started flying at a very furious rate here about 9 years ago and has not stopped. We had a little bit of a reprieve here in Colorado last summer, but there's really not a day that goes by in between pretty much April 1st and in essence October 1st that hail doesn't fly somewhere in this state every day. We are now just moved into the number 2 spot of all states that have major hail exposure. And so we have definitely been contributing to a national crisis with regards to storm damage and things like that. So your homeowner's insurance, your business insurance from a property perspective will continue to inch up, unfortunately. But it's something we're working hard on as an insurance agency to bring several options to our clients so that you don't feel pigeonholed into one carrier. And we continue to have access to as many carriers as we can so that we're bringing the best value at all times.
For things like hail damage, are there some are there zip codes that are better than others, or how do they determine your specific risk of hail, or is it just Colorado at large?
Yeah, nothing really west of I would say C470 or anything in the foothills or mountains is being surcharged at all at this point in time. Although we have had some storms in the last couple of years up in the conifer area, Evergreen even, that were just unheard of before. And so Mother Nature's doing something different than we've ever seen her do before. We don't want to say that you can't be hailed on in the mountains. You certainly can be, but for the most part, it's the Front Range of Colorado. Not even the Western Slope really is incurring much hail, and nor does it historically, but it's primarily the Eastern Slope.
I don't know if you took a look over the foothills when you came in, but it's getting pretty darn dark.
Yeah, it is. I haven't
Saw
looked
that.
at the radar, but yeah, it's just a matter of time.
We replaced hail
Yes.
last year with fire.
Yes, fire
So,
too. That's
there you
another
go.
thing. I forgot to mention that. We're still uncertain what last year's fire season is going to do to property rates, but just because you're not in the mountains doesn't mean you won't help pay for the losses that occurred up there last year.
And thank you, very insightful. So we're number 2. We got to try harder.
Yeah, yep. And we trade, Texas and Oklahoma trade spots every once in a while. So we're kind of maybe 2 or 3, depending on where.
It might not be. the
Texas
one
has
we
a
wanna win.
geographic advantage. They're just
Yeah, they do.
A lot
That's right.
bigger. Great stuff. Well, thank you. Well, pipe in. Let's change the topic and start with Mike and Nate. And you want your PowerPoint? Let me pull it up.
I can pull it up. Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
So share that PowerPoint. Nate is an overachiever and put together things to make the rest of us look
Thanks,
bad,
Nate.
but we love him anyway. So,
I just thought it would be helpful. So what I'm going to go over here is, I'll go back to Jeff here real quick. Insurance is always the easiest way to cover your monetary risk, and that or your monetary exposure. Like if you're going to have exposure, you want to have someone else pay it. And that's certainly where insurance comes in. What I'm going to talk about is how we mitigate or potentially limit some of that financial exposure. So what I've got up on the screen is the saying, from Poor Richard's Almanac, a penny saved is a penny earned. And I'm going to swap into that protected in place of saved. So penny protected is a penny earned. So the more that we can protect from exposure to even insurance coverages, our rates go down, all that other stuff factors in. So it always makes sense to institute some level of liability shields, which is what I'm going to be talking about. And I just felt that the PowerPoint would be more helpful to see some of this rather than hear me just talk about it. So
You're forgiven.
thank you. The common questions are, how do I protect my personal property from my rental property? Meaning you have rental property that you're leasing to third parties and you have your stuff. You want to create some barrier between the people who rent your property from getting hurt and going after your stuff. So we'll talk about that. Does a revocable trust provide asset protection? And I'll just answer that because I don't actually have a slide on that. The general response there is no. Revocable trusts are more estate planning vehicles than anything. They do not provide asset protection for the grantor, the person who creates it. And then last, how does using an LLC protect me or my property from creditors? And that's where we're going to spend a lot of time. So I'm going to flip through some of these wordy slides. You can read them. But in general, the types of things we're protecting against are third-party liabilities, creditor liabilities. If you're in an occupation where there's a lot of professional liability, a doctor or other type of professional, you might have personal liability where you want to segment that out where it's beyond what you might be able to get in terms of malpractice coverage. And then if you just have substantial surplus assets that you don't need for, your lifestyle maintenance, these are the things we're talking about protecting and mitigating the exposure. So the types of vehicles we use are limited liability companies, limited partnerships. You've also heard of them as LLCs and LPs, and then corporations or Incs, and then trusts. And there's different types of trusts. I've already indicated that revocable trusts are not asset protection vehicles, but third-party settled trusts, i.e. someone else creates the trust for your benefit. Those can have liability protection pieces to it. And then at the extreme, there's the offshore stuff, which I really won't address today. But the important thing to think, and I'll certainly elicit input from Mike and Jeff on this, is at every stage, the legal structuring is never a replacement for the other things that Jeff already talked about. And then with any kind of legal structuring, there are at some level accounting and tax reporting implications. So we'll try to do that in real time and bring in your.
So a quick question on the trust piece. The revocable isn't an asset protection vehicle, but is an irrevocable trust.
It is, and we'll talk to irrevocable trusts. Those are the third-party settled trusts. Generally speaking, a self-settled irrevocable trust doesn't qualify for much asset protection unless you are forming it and complying with an asset protection statute. And there's a number of states that have domestic asset protection statutes where if you do certain things, you're in the clear as far as domestic claims or presumably domestic claims being made against those trusts. Another important disclaimer with this slide is that this is, this presentation is information purposes only. I'm not providing legal advice to any individual situation and cannot be relied on as legal advice. And that's because every situation's different. There's no single way to secure asset protection. Some of these are very basic slides. You'll see the applicability, but that's important to remember as well. So here's a basic example of how an LLC provides asset protection. You own a rental property. This is the easiest way to describe it. And rather than own that rental property as yourself, you put it into an LLC, a limited liability company, and you may be the single owner of that entity, but by virtue of putting it in, you've now created this blue liability barrier. And the important thing is to understand in this context, the limitations of that. If you have a tenant, they slip and fall, it's your fault for not maintaining the property appropriately. Your insurance will kick in at that point to help pay for it. But say the claims are in excess of your insurance limits, they want to get a judgment that goes beyond that and come after you. With this structure in place, the most they could do is secure a lien against the property. Again, that's not great, but all your other stuff is protected. Everything above that blue line, assuming you've kept intact the appropriate corporate formalities, which includes keeping separate books and records and that sort of thing.
So color commentary on my side is when I talk to my clients, I just like you just did, I specify, hey, I'm not an attorney, I can't give legal advice, but correct me if I'm wrong and add your color on this, but the first thing is if you're ever litigated, the first thing they want to know is what's your entity structure,
Right.
right? Are you a sole proprietor? Are you an LLC? What S corp? What are you? Right? And then they look at it and they say, all right, do you have, are you current with the Secretary of State? Right? You have to pay that $10 fee every year to keep your structure legit in covering your asset. Third one is, do you have an operating agreement? And the biggie there is I have so many clients that come in and go, what's that?
Yeah.
And they have no idea that they even need it, right? So that ties you as the owner to the LLC and gives you certain rights within that LLC.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more perfunctory or formality than anything, especially at the single member level. You're having an agreement with yourself.
Right.
But it is a formality that is indicative of the fact, and this is why the separate books and records or financials are so important, is that you're not paying for your haircut out of it. You're not paying your personal mortgage payment. You're not commingling these assets.
That's the next two bullet point items.
Yeah.
Is one is do you have a separate business account for the LLC? And are you commingling business with personal accounts?
So just having an LLC, very good point, is just having an LLC and dropping the title into the LLC does not alone solve your problem. There are additional steps. It is more formal, but with that formality, you've now just protected everything up above that blue line.
So when you are litigated, you have all those 5 things, kind of covered. I mean, the attorneys are trying to pierce that corporate veil to get at your
The
personal
blue
assets.
line, yeah. The thin blue line.
The thin blue line.
Yeah, and I'll just say on the coattails of that, Mike, it's very important that insurance contract that you see on the left side of the page there is written in the name of the LLC, not in your name, or even has your name on it personally. So that all kind of keeps that corporate veil clean and unpenetrated.
One other brief commentary I'll make on this is oftentimes these properties are financed, and there's some issues that come into play there in terms of moving a property that you purchased and financed in your own name into an LLC. But keeping in mind that even if we do drop that into an LLC and you're on the note or you're on the mortgage, you can't avoid that financial liability. That's something that still is an exposure. Only way to get around that is to actually have the property be the financing entity and have it somehow be not recourse debt. So
the other thing too is when you actually move that title into the LLC, if banks are paying attention, which 99% of them aren't, they can call the note due.
Yeah,
if they see
we
the
can always
transfer
fix
title.
that too. So
You can always
we can play a game of curing the default.
Yep.
Yeah. So moving on to this is a often overlooked issue with single member LLCs, particularly in Colorado. Some states you don't have this problem, but it's the outside liability in. So we talked about how when you have the property in the LLC, you're protected from liabilities through the property up to you. However, if you are a single owner of a limited liability company in Colorado and you're in a traffic accident, you still have insurance. So insurance is going to pay it. But say you cause a 30-car pileup, you've maxed out your limits, everybody's suing you, and all your stuff is in this LLC. All you got left is in the LLC, and you want to claim that they can't get at it because it's in a company, it's not your stuff. Well, in Colorado, they can get judgments that will force you to liquidate a single member or a single owner limited liability company so that they can get at that property. They can force a liquidation if there's no other owners involved, if there's no other diversity of interest. So that's an important thing to remember. One thing also I'll point out about the single member LLC to also refer to Mike is, as a single member LLC, if you're not doing anything different, you are a disregarded entity for tax purposes. So that means everything flows through to the Schedule C, or if it's a rental property, it's
Schedule E.
Schedule E.
Yep.
So you'll still look like an entity-less tax return, even though you may have multiple single member LLCs.
By the way, Carl, are we recording this?
We are.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we'll put
I'm
this on
learning
the
some
web.
things. I want to.
You want to refresh?
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
So what
There'll be a
I've
quiz for you afterwards.
Okay.
What I have shown on this slide is a different type of external creditor. You have a bank that is coming after you for a loan in default. Same principles exist. If you've taken out too much credit and you have assets in an LLC that you are the sole owner of, they can come after those assets. So not a whole lot adding on that slide, just showing how it applies in different contexts. So here is a partial fix to that problem, which is have an entity that's owned by two people. From a tax perspective, the first thing that comes into play here is the minute you introduce a new owner into that holding co, as I've got it labeled here, it becomes a tax partnership.
It comes to 1065 form, correct?
So I don't know if you want to speak to that just real quickly, a little bit, what that means to become a partnership as opposed to disregarded entity.
Well, one, it takes you off of either Schedule E or Schedule C, puts you onto a 1065 return, which by definition, you're still an LLC. You're still a limited liability company for legal purposes, but for tax filing purposes, you're now a multi-member LLC, which defaults you to the partnership. Partnership, in similarity to Schedule C, if you're a business, you're still subject to the self-employment tax. If you're Schedule E, it flows through to your personal return still as Schedule C income, which is passive.
So if that's an active trade or business, it would be self-employment tax. If it's rental properties, it doesn't convert, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the other point there is that what they'll get is a K1.
Look at a K1.
And that K1 is what they'll use to plug in the numbers on
Right.
their 1040. So the liability protection aspects of the slide. So I've illustrated a few things here. Is you have a holding company, because again, if we have a single LLC and we start acquiring multiple properties in a single LLC, now all those multiple properties are sharing liabilities with each other. So anytime, especially in Colorado, I show an alternate structure here. Sometimes outside of Colorado, you use a different type of structure, but entities are so easy to form in Colorado that we drop each property under its own limited liability company. Each one of those property SPEs, as I call them, are disregarded entities as to the holding company. So there's not 4 different tax returns there. There's just
Right,
the
there's just
one
one.
holding company tax return. And so we essentially have 2 different liability protections there. We have the bottom blue line, which protects the liability from property to property, as well as upstream to the holding company. And then the holding company, because it's now a partnership under Colorado law, as long as that second owner has more than just what we call de minimis ownership, that now protects the forced liquidation. All that outside creditor can do now is get a judgment against, it's called a charging order. They can't even foreclose the interest in a limited liability company, meaning they can't take the ownership from you. They just get like a garnishment essentially against that ownership, so that any distributions that come out, they can grab them when and if they come out. So it really chills collection efforts. It creates a fairly solid chilling of some of those recovery efforts that might ensue as a result of a liability from the outside in. Again, we still have the slip and fall protection. The only property exposed there is the one that has the slip and fall on it. And I don't have the insurance up here, but you know, the holding company really doesn't do anything. It's just a holding company, but you might name that as an additional insured as well, but you know.
Yeah, good question. And my question is back to you here, Nate. In the insurance industry, when we have several different entities like this that are commonly owned at least 51% or more, we can actually insure all 3 of these properties on one policy. What would be your recommendation there? I mean, does that feel like it is commingling some assets that we maybe shouldn't?
As long as you're sharing the cost of that policy pro rata, or, you know, I don't know if those can be premiums.
We can break them out.
Break
Sure.
them out. That would be the ideal way, is that they're properly accounted for among the properties.
So looking at this again, books and records, you're looking at each LLC holding its own set of financial statements, its own bank account.
Right.
Everything consolidates up into the holding company for reporting purposes on the 1065.
So yeah, as we start to branch out here, things become a little bit more complicated. But again, we're trying to preserve and protect what people have accumulated or what they're building. So here I introduce the 3rd layer of asset protection. This is tiered LLCs with multiple owners, including what I'll call a spousal trust, which I'm using the spouse as the 3rd party settler in this case. Husband and wife, the wife makes a gift of her interest into a trust. So she owns, call it 50% or 1%, but I have her contributing the other 99%. So before this, or 98%. So before this, she owned 99, husband owned 1%. she throws 98% into a trust for the benefit of the husband, makes him the trustee of that trust. That does, even in Colorado, afford you a fair amount of liability protection as to the husband. The creditors going after the husband cannot get at those assets in the trust. A wife's creditor might be able to go after those assets to some extent, but the husbands cannot. And then we still have the same blue lines down below. Nothing's really changed down there. The one thing I'll point out here, again, from a Mike perspective, is those trusts typically are set up as what we call grantor trusts.
Sure.
So even though the wife has given away 98% of her ownership in the company, we're not filing a separate tax return for that trust. It may even have its own tax ID number, but how do you address that where it has its own tax ID number, it has its own bank accounts, it's getting its own K1.
If it's generating income, it's a grantor trust, it's really a transparent entity. The information just flows back onto the personal return as if there were no trust.
Right. So that's the liability shield that we use when people are, I'll use the doctors as an example, is where a doctor has a concern that he's going to have a patient liability, medical malpractice, and they want to take some of their surplus assets that they don't use to live on, they stick them in this trust, and and the husband, the doctor in this case, could be reversed. So I don't mean to be, exclusive in any way. As the trustee of that trust can still manage and deal with those assets however they feel like it. So as money flows up from the holding company into the trust, they can go out and buy additional properties or make additional investments through that trust. It doesn't really impair the ability to access those assets for purposes of continued growth, and even to some extent lifestyle maintenance. We from an estate tax perspective try to look at these assets as last ditch, rainy day type stuff, because we're really protecting it from both tax and creditors.
I thought the doctor is a really interesting example because much of what you've talked about so far has been, for example, real estate owners. And a doctor might not be, but could have significant liability and benefit from asset protection strategies.
Correct.
Right.
That's absolutely right. And this is a variation, just introducing the straight up asset protection trusts. You used to, probably 10, 15 years ago, the only way to get into a quote unquote asset protection trust was to go offshore, which was great for attorneys who had to travel to the Caymans or the Cook Islands and set these things up. But unfortunately now it's, places like South Dakota and Delaware and Utah and Las Vegas. So maybe Las Vegas is the sexiest asset protection jurisdiction that we presently have. But the ones I use more frequently now than before are the Utah ones. And just as an example, the way that Utah works, you can, as an individual, take your stuff, put it into a trust. You have to have what they call an independent trustee regarding distribution. So again, we're looking at putting this stuff more or less out of reach for day-to-day living. This is not a way to protect the stuff you need to maintain your lifestyle. It's a way to protect everything else. But you take that stuff and you put it in the trust, and you publish notice that and give notice to known creditors that you've done this. And they have 6 months to make any active claims. If they don't have an active claim, there's nothing for them to do. At the close of 6 months, all claims are barred as to those assets, as long as you haven't committed fraud and those sorts of things. So that one has a little more procedural, elements to it, but I think it makes it stronger as a strategy than the ones that don't require any notice to creditors. One of the reasons I think a lot of people like Nevada is it's a 1-year statute of limitations, but in Utah, if you give notice, it's 6 months. So if you have the concern that there's an impending potential liability that could be outside of 6 months, it's a great way to get ahead of that. And you don't have to be a Utah resident, you just have to be a Utah trust for that, which means your independent trustee would have to be a Utah trustee, but banks and other entities can serve that function. So that's essentially how an asset protection trust works, and it can be self-settled. If it's not self-settled, I usually don't go the asset protection trust route unless there's a real potential for known liability and you want the extra protection. But third-party settled trusts, you usually can just go straight up without using the asset protection trust vehicle. And this is the variation on the single member LLC underneath for the properties and there's the rich dad, poor dad, Robert Kiyosaki no trademark infringement intended. He promotes this type of structure a lot through his seminars, which is to use what's called a land trust. It's just basically a grantor trust that is designed to give liability protection from the property upstream, because the trust is the owner of the property, but it's effectively a grantor trust for tax purposes, and you can own the properties in these land trusts, and they don't require as much. They don't require state filings to maintain them. They just exist as long as the trust is in existence. So that's just an example of a variation on the tiered structure using trusts.
And in these days now, when you look at the land trusts, I don't know, I remember them about 10 years ago, and the issue was more along the lines of privacy. Still existing today?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why they're also beneficial, because there is no state filing. You can name your land trust the Vulcan Land Trust, if you're a Star Trek fan, and nobody's going to know who owns it, who can sign for it, outside of specific transactional revelation.
So if there's litigation, it's very difficult for an attorney to find
out where you have assets.
Yep.
That's another why people use a lot of times, they use Wyoming LLCs, similar identity protection structures with more express liability shield. So that's why I say at the beginning, every situation is going to vary a little bit, but those are also kind of tax nothings, disregarded entities. So here I've shown just one variation on kind of the tiered LLC with multiple owners is also employing the use of a management company. And this is often the case where you have multiple owners of the property, maybe different people investing to purchase the property, but you have maybe one or more of those, or somebody's kid that's actually managing the properties and setting up a separate entity for that person to draw their management fee, act as the landlord, kind of creates another barrier between the actual property itself and operating each property separately versus consolidating that management through a company. You probably do this if you had more than 3, but if you're getting upwards of like 5, 10 investment properties, using a management company to consolidate all those leases and collections and everything through one company, so you're making sure everything goes into the right account. With the management company, it's just all going into the management company. Accounting and
accounting goes crazy with that one.
Yeah, but it does simplify making sure the right checks are going to the right accounts and that sort of thing. And that's essentially like hiring a property manager that you create, and probably some additional liability protection there. But generally speaking, the management company, being the agent of the specific properties, can't delegate all its legal responsibility to the management company. But they'd probably, a litigant would probably first look to the management company for having not properly managed, and maybe then try to go after the property. And just a real quick overview of how split interest trusts work. And the reason why I've included this one is a lot of time people will ask about, how do I protect my personal residence outside of insurance, outside of an umbrella policy? One way to do it is to create an asset that nobody wants to go after. And that's what we're doing here. Is a split interest trust is where you're basically taking the asset, putting it into a trust, a grantor trust. So normally it wouldn't give us any asset protection, but we're splitting up that interest. So I'm retaining as the grantor a use of the property for 20 years, and then the trust gives to the beneficiaries the balance of that interest. So all I have as an individual anymore, it's an irrevocable trust, but all I have as an individual is use of the property for 20 years. So if someone wanted to come after me and try to take my house, all they could really take is the 20-year interest, or the balance of that 20-year interest. After that, the trust owns it and gives it to the children. So it is a way, again, to bifurcate a little bit of that ownership, create kind of like we did with the partnership, creating a 2 ownership structure. We've created a 2 interest structure here, where we've retained what the market would consider a very useless interest, because it's not like, even if they foreclosed your 20-year interest, last time I checked, I've never seen any listings for 20-year interest in a personal residence. They don't.
Not sure what the value is that it's going to be.
They don't really exist.
Pretty minimal.
Do they assume the expenses on that property as well?
Generally speaking, those trusts are set up so that while the life tenant or the term tenant is they cover the maintenance costs, and any capital expenditures would be covered by the trust. So roof replacement and structural problems are trust expenses, but your utilities and ongoing general maintenance are the life or the term tenant's responsibility.
So staying on the real estate rental piece of this, what do you say to real estate holders who say, I just buy a big insurance policy. I don't put them in LLCs or structure any. I just hold them in my name and I just get insurance policies for them.
Yeah, that works as long as you don't have a liability that exceeds policy limits. Because if the liability, and I'll use a tragic example that happened here in Colorado a few years back. Someone owned a property up in the mountains. Family was renting there. I think they actually got it through a prize. And there was a carbon monoxide leak. The whole family died, parents and 4 children or something like that. That more likely not is going to exceed any policy limits you have on even a rental property coverage. So now the person who owned that property, if they didn't own it through an LLC, has potential exposure to all that. So it's all about policy limits and what your real exposure is. I've also talked to people who have had rental properties that became condemned because of methamphetamine contamination. And, sometimes we're talking about liabilities that far exceed what ultimately the property value might be.
Right.
So if you have a property that you own directly, becomes a meth lab, and you're now responsible for the cleanup, that property just went to zero.
Right.
And now you're responsible for paying all the expenses of the cleanup. Hard, unless, I don't know, is there insurance coverage for stuff like that, or?
Cash, yeah, great question. That we get into pollution coverage then at that point in time, right? That's in essence what we're talking about. And there are limitations, I'll just say that, on all property policies and specifically liability policies that do limit coverage for pollution or pollution exposure.
I'll stop here. Awesome.
Well, great job. That was really informative. There's a lot to learn. I've got just a couple of high-level questions. So just to recap, it's not just real estate owners that need to divide their assets or think about trusts or LLCs, right? A lot of people need to.
No, absolutely. I kind of maybe soft.
It's an easy example to understand.
The real estate's a really easy example to illustrate and put up on display, but any operating company, and I would say, even the tiered structure, and we're doing this more and more, sometimes businesses evolve over time. And you may have been this single line of business when you started, but then you started acquiring either lateral or vertical integrated components of that, but you just rolled them all up into the same entity. It may make a lot of sense to start breaking those out into their divisional sections. They can be disregarded or consolidated for tax reporting and accounting purposes, but keeping your distribution separate and apart from your manufacturing, separate and apart from other elements of a business, work the same way that having 3 different properties are. If you have or even like a logistics arm where you've got guys on the road trucking product, you don't want that truck driver who now runs over somebody to create a liability for your manufacturing arm.
Right. So you could create companies really that make sense for you and your situation and whatever's unique to your business, and trying to isolate that liability doesn't necessarily need to complicate your taxes or anything else.
Yeah, I usually try to minimize taxes, but in minimizing taxes, there's almost always an element of structural complexity.
Yeah. There's a trade-off.
There is.
That's the complaint I usually get from the clients.
After they've come to see
more
me,
work.
after they've come to see me, they go to Mike and they say, "What has he done?"
I go, now we got to do this. And he's like, "Oh, that's very complicated." I go, not for me, it's not.
But as I always say, is if I could just go to the IRS and say this person deserves to pay less tax, I'd do it. But that doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Excellent.
But this is more about liability than tax. But there's usually overlapping concerns.
So. For certain. Well, any closing thoughts, gentlemen, before we open it up to any questions our audience might have?
Man, we covered a lot.
We did.
Yeah.
We did. Well, if there's anybody who'd like to pipe in with a question, you can put it in the chat menu, and I'll take everybody off.
I'll pipe in and ask Jeff a question real quick.
Yeah.
From a personal litigation perspective, if someone gets injured at a rental property and they have $1 million policy and they fall and break their back, and they're paralyzed from the waist down, a personal injury attorney's, going to go after 10 million bucks. What do you see in your line of work? If you see those types of claims, what do you see coming back from an insurance claim perspective?
Yeah, we do. We see a lot of these types of claims, maybe not to the amount of 10 million all the time, but certainly I think one of the things that comes to mind, it's very important to have a good, solid leasing agreement in place because in Colorado and I know many other states, we are a premises liability driven state and court of law. So if an injury occurs on that premises, in essence, the owner or title holder of that particular property is going to definitely be responsible, but that liability can be transferred to, in essence, the tenant who is occupying the property, because the premise around, or the idea around this, is that that person most likely would not have been there had they not been visiting the tenant that was under lease or occupying the property at the time. So we have layers of liability that come into play here. And the tenant is typically the first one in line. And when the tenant's insurance is maxed out, or maybe the tenant doesn't have insurance, that's again bad business on the property owner's part, right? We need to make sure that our property owners are keeping adequate records of current insurance for their tenants. But once that limit is exhausted, then the property owner could, in essence, be liable for the remainder. And that could go into their excess liability limit as well. So very important for property owners to not only require their tenants to have insurance, but also require a specific amount of insurance. For commercial properties, we see at least $1 million, if not $2 million, being required for most tenants. And on residential properties, goodness, I guess 300,000 is a good start, but I would encourage 500 or even $1 million of coverage there.
So real quick on the renter's insurance, that covers more than just possessions in the property. It covers.
There's an element of personal liability as well. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yep.
Really good. Any questions from the audience that you'd like to type in now? You can put it in the chat menu or just go ahead and speak. Take yourself off mute anytime you're comfortable.
Radio silence.
Radio silence. While we're sitting here thinking.
This is Mark Feldman. I'm one of Chad's clients, and I have a quick question.
Please. Thanks.
So it's a very personal one, but we own a personal watercraft, and our daughter wants to use it. She's in her mid-20s with all her friends. And so we're concerned about when she takes that out, if something were to happen with that Sea-Doo in our name, that any liability could come back to us. So we're talking about transferring the ownership of that Sea-Doo to her, have her get her own insurance, remove it from our property and things. And I just want to make sure that's going to actually protect us from any kind of ability for anybody to come back to us.
That's a great question, gentlemen. Dive in.
Yeah.
How old is she again?
In her 20s.
Okay.
She's in her 20s. Mark, does she live with you?
She does not.
Okay. Well, I can take a stab at it if you guys have any other input. Mark, by all means, I think a great strategy there for sure, provided she's not a dependent of yours any longer. I think transferring ownership is a great start. I would also encourage her, in addition to that, to make sure that she gets personal watercraft insurance. It's not required. It's crazy. I mean, auto insurance is, right? But you can go on any reservoir here in Colorado and not have to proof of insurance. You might have to do something around registering it. I'm not sure. I haven't owned a watercraft in quite some time, but yeah, I would just say transfer of ownership, great first start. Second step, have her get some personal liability or watercraft liability on that unit. And I would I would start at 300,000 and maybe even encourage her to go to 500,000 at the very least, depending on how many assets she has to protect. And then it's very inexpensive coverage. So I think that should accomplish what you're hoping to accomplish, Mark. And then anytime you want to own it or borrow it, she can do that through just giving you permission. So there's permissive use laws in Colorado, which also would make you an insured then under her policy. So maybe a win-win there.
Okay, and then so that we were going to get the personal watercraft insurance for the one follow-up question would be to help protect her. Would there be a reason for her to get from her friends and or anyone else that comes along like a waiver of release or limitation of liability document signed?
Yeah, I can say that we have seen that definitely in the like nonprofit, and to some extent, whenever there's an activity involved, corporate activity that's not part of the revenue production side, and so yeah, waivers of liability can certainly extend down to the personal side, where if her friends were coming on a trip with her and she wanted to make sure they didn't go after her insurance and that sort of thing, you could certainly attempt to shield liability using a waiver, but waivers are sometimes of dubious enforceability.
Right, yeah.
In terms of like knowledge of what they've done or full understanding of the rights they've waived. So a good litigator will usually and frequently successfully overcome a waiver barrier, but it's certainly something to throw back in their face when they say, I just lost my left toe because of this and I want to sue you for it. And you can throw up you assumed all liability. But so I wouldn't say it's not worth it. It certainly creates an interesting interpersonal relationship with the friends, but
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Before she was old enough to own it, we actually made their parents sign something like that. So
yeah,
we don't know whether we knew it doesn't always stand up, but at least it was something. So, all right.
Yeah, swimming pools, trampolines, you see it more frequently, especially as people, those people who have kind of open borders and open access to their properties need to at least do something to, when they let people come on and use stuff to have other people at least attempt to assume the exposure.
Yeah, I think just in following up on that comment, the liability waiver that somebody has to sign actually just, I think, gets them to think twice about actually filing a lawsuit, right? Yeah. I mean, that's probably what brings the most weight to a liability waiver. The reality is this: ownership brings liability. That's really where the big connection is in Colorado. And really most states in the U.S. If you own something, you also assume the liability, whether you've given that person even permission to use it or if they even misused it. Ownership actually, unfortunately, is one of those things you're going to connect you
with
to.
Limited exception, it would be trespass would void that presumption. Like if someone
there you go
illegally trespassed on your property or stole your property, and then like they stole your car and then got in a car accident and wanted to sue you for a defective tire, that ain't gonna fly. So
yeah, but the third party that they hit could go ahead and potentially attach damages to your car that was stolen. So important to have insurance on cars all the time, regardless if you're using them or not. That's another good point.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. We have time for another one if anybody has any questions in the audience. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you. I am a client of all of your firms, and I know we benefit from you protecting our assets, and our clients benefit indirectly from that. So anybody here who'd like to take it, get some free advice, please reach out to any one of us, and we will put this on the web. Share this with your friends. check out the Expert Network Team podcast. You can download it at Apple, Spotify, or just at expertnetworkteam.com. Next month, we're going to talk about cybersecurity and protecting yourself online. And soon we'll bring back Bart Combs or another person to talk about personal protection. We thought he was great. And maybe this time he'll throw Mike over his shoulder.
Yeah, that'd be good. A little demonstration.
All right,
That'll be
everybody.
interesting.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the information we shared.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to share it with someone else and join us next time.
If you want to meet with a member of the team, please contact us at info@expertnetworkteam.com. That's info@expertnetworkteam.com.
If you have special topics you'd like to hear about, please reach out to us and let us know at the same email address. Again, that's info@expertnetworkteam.com. Thank you for joining us and have a great day. Thank you for listening to this podcast. We want to remind you that listening to this podcast does not establish a client-professional relationship with any of the firms represented, nor does it constitute legal, investment, or accounting advice, and the views are those of the professionals only.
Investment advisory services may be provided through ANI Financial Services, and securities may be provided through Genios Wealth Management.